Now, Dwayne? Yep. Got it. Never mind. Well, John, we'll get started. And
Oh, people still coming in, it looks
got
like.
some people coming in, yeah.
If I just grab a glass of water, I'll be gone in like 3 seconds.
Sure.
The water's right
Hey, Anthony.
Evening.
there. Okay,
Um, I hope we may have a few more folks who will come on. But regardless, I think we should get started. Respect your time. We'll have you do a presentation and then open up for some Q&A. I'm glad that Dwayne is recording it because I do think, I know that we'll send ours out to the congregation. I think the material that you're going to be covering and the way that you cover it will be very helpful for all of our folks, certainly those tonight, but also those who hopefully can access the video. Welcome, everybody. Glad you're here. Our guest tonight is John Hamilton. He's the President and Chief Executive Officer of Liberation Programs. They deal with addiction and mental health issues. John's been the President and CEO since 2018. I'll let him do a little more introduction of himself, whatever he feels comfortable with. But just to say that both Dwayne and I wanted to have him on the Tuesday evening education program with our churches because we experienced a program that John offered to the clergy last fall, and it was just really, really well done. Talking about, again, addiction, a lot of the research that's being done in terms of what's happening with the brain and behavioral stuff, and then how then to engage with people, and I think in a way that's much different than perhaps even a generation ago people may have been engaging mental health and addiction issues. So, John, we're delighted that you're with us, and I'll let you do any more introductions that you'd like, and really look forward to your presentation. We'll, present for however long, and then we usually go till about 8, and if there's, we'll have some time, I'm sure, for some Q&A, and when it's about that time, we'll wrap up when it makes sense. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me again. And I'm honored to be here tonight. And again, I'm John Hamilton, and I've been involved in the work of addiction prevention, treatment, and recovery my whole adult life. I started 42 years ago at Fairfield Hills Hospital in Newtown when they had a drug treatment program there, and just fell in love with the work and never looked back. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor. I actually still have a private practice in New Canaan, Connecticut. I see people on Saturdays just to keep my hands in the work. But I'm honored to also be part of Liberation Programs, which is one of the largest behavioral health agencies in Fairfield County. I'm going to got a couple of slides to describe some of the work we're doing, but we have offices from Greenwich all the way through Bridgeport, providing prevention, treatment, recovery services, outreach, and harm reduction to the community. So that's what we're doing. So, Dwayne, if I can share my screen, which I think you've set this up where I can, I have a whole bunch of slides. What I'm going to cover tonight is a brief overview of what we know about addiction, how the brain works, and what we know works in treatment, the vulnerability of youth and addiction, some of the drug trends, how to talk to your kids about drugs, and a little bit about our program. So I'm going to cover a lot of information. But I'd like to start out with this first slide, because this first slide actually is pretty telling. It comes from the National Institute of Drug Abuse. It seems almost trite in its messaging, but it's the answer to why people do drugs from a brain chemistry standpoint. People do drugs for 2 reasons only: to feel good or to feel better. And again, it seems like such a simple definition, but it has broad implications. People that are doing drugs to connect to others. And when we say drugs, we also include alcohol as a substance. And it's connecting them to their feelings and having positive experiences, and they're sharing those experiences with others. We won't see them in liberation programs. They'll get through life unscathed, although a caveat now, and I'll mention in a couple of slides, is with this fentanyl epidemic, sadly and tragically, even experimental use of one pill could kill when a kid finds a pill that they think is something else and it's laced with fentanyl. But that said, for the most part, people that are doing substances to connect to their community and the presence of others are not people that we see in treatment programs. Who we see are people that do drugs to feel better. They may have started to feel good, but as they had increased exposure to certain substances, it increases risk. But many people out of the gate are self-medicating. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, trauma, anxiety, depression, and it's really about disconnecting, disconnection to feelings, disconnecting to community, disconnecting to themselves. Johann Hari is a British journalist who wrote a book called Chasing the Screen. And in this book, he summarized what he knows about addiction from following around the world best treatment and how people should be treated in addiction. And his conclusion is that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Again, disconnection represents when people have problems with substances. Connection is part of what recovery and the solution. That makes sense. This is a slide from the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. It's the federal agency that oversees and monitors drug trends. And this is a slide that come out in 2020, predicting 100,000 deaths by 2025 in the country for opiate overdoses. Tragically, we're ahead of schedule. Last year in 2023, we had 104,000 deaths in this country. And that is actually more deaths than colon cancer and breast cancer combined. So it's really become a problem around the country that is like at a proportion we've never seen before. And needless to say, with the COVID pandemic, social isolation and disconnection to others just increased relapse rates, increased substance misuse rates. And let's face it, during these dark times, during that period of shared experience was a sense of hopelessness and despair. There weren't too many people doing substances to feel good. Most people were just trying to get by and feel better. In Connecticut alone, we had tragically over 1,400 deaths last year, and 85% of those overdose deaths included fentanyl. And now over 25% of all the deaths that are happening in the last 6 months have xylazine in them. I'm not even going to cover xylazine at this point, but xylazine is an animal tranquilizer. If you've ever been having to sadly put your animal down, a dog down in a veterinarian hospital, the first shot that they give them is xylazine. So it's an animal tranquilizer that's used to extend the high of those that are using fentanyl, because fentanyl is 50 times more potent than heroin, but it also is rapid acting. So instead of lasting 3 to 4 hours like heroin, it only lasts an hour. So the xylazine keeps the high longer. So what is fentanyl? As I said, it's 50 times stronger than heroin. It is sold as a white powder, and most of it comes through, that we know of at this point, through China. And it's very, very deadly. In fact, this slide is, I think, very telling. What you see on the right of that slide is a ruler, and that ruler is 2 inches. So these are 2-inch vials. To the left, that's the lethal amount of heroin. It's the far left vial. The middle vial, that's the lethal amount of fentanyl, and to the right, carfentanil, that's the lethal amount that would kill somebody. So the amount of it takes the amount of fentanyl on Lincoln's beard, or carfentanil on Lincoln's beard, on a penny to be able to kill most individuals. The other real problem is cross-contamination, and that there are pill pressers now that people can get on eBay, where people will take pills, like for instance, Adderall now is a shortage nationally. So people are taking methamphetamine powder and pressing it into a pill, which is bad enough. But now they're actually tainting it with fentanyl, and it could be lethal. So this is Xanax versus the counterfeit Xanax and oxycodone and Adderall. And as you can see, they look very similar. The only difference is the pills to the right all contain fentanyl. People don't start just jumping into a drug lifestyle of fentanyl, though. The reality is that if you misuse alcohol, you're twice as likely to get involved in fentanyl. If you misuse marijuana, you're 3 times more likely to get involved in fentanyl. If you misuse cocaine, now it propels up to 15 times more likely to get involved in fentanyl. And if you're involved in other opiate analgesics, which include Percocet, Oxycontin, Vicodin, now your chances are 40 times greater than the general population of getting involved in fentanyl abuse. And what we knew is that this problem actually several years ago started as a prescription drug problem, as people were aware of the over prescribing and over marketing of Oxycontin, for instance, created this prescription opiate problem. And then we were able to be responsive as a country and put regulations restricting the access to this over prescribed and over distributed pain medication pills. So unfortunately, it addressed the supply, but not the demand. So a cohort of those individuals that were actually already dependent on those substances literally had to turn to the streets and get heroin instead. So it went from an Oxycontin and prescription drug epidemic to a heroin epidemic, and then to a fentanyl epidemic. This is how complex drug addiction is. It isn't just one part of the brain. It's the interaction of the environment with the behavior, with the brain mechanism, with the drug itself and the physiology, with your DNA, with your history of your experience with drugs. It all affects your potential for addiction. So, as I said, people want to know, is it nature or nurture? Is it your environment or your DNA? It's both. In fact, it's the drug exposure compounded by the environment, and particularly a stressful environment, compounded by a genetic predisposition, which can only attribute 25 to 40% of the variable. So it's that synergy of the 3 playing together. In fact, there's a whole new field now called epigenetics, which is the understanding of the expression of genes under stress. This is your brain, and this is the different parts of the brain that are affected, 5 different parts of the brain that are really targeted and exposed to being affected with substance use, most of it being the dopamine pathways and the serotonin pathways. This is your brain on drugs on the left. So these are brain imaging scans, and on the left-hand side of the control group. And the idea here is to look at the fact that a healthy, normal brain that has healthy dopamine regulation, which is the orange, is someone who can experience joy in the reward systems in a natural way. But to the right, this is what happens to the brain when it gets exposed to drugs. So as you can see, to the top right, that's the brain to the on cocaine, methamphetamine, alcohol, and heroin. So those that are drug misusers have less reward circuitry than non-drug users. So their dopamine, their ability to regulate their dopamine is more challenging than other individuals. They oftentimes won't get the same sense of joy out of riding a bike or an activity that other people will. So it's really kind of having the drugs kind of do a kind of a boost of their dopamine to get it to a normal level that most people have. I find this slide really fascinating. So again, with the understanding of brain imaging, and remember, the more orange the brain, the more normal it is, and the ability to experience joy in a healthy dopamine system. To the left here on this slide are primates that were caged, and as you can see, there's very little dopamine. And then what they did is they put them in a group environment, and to the right, the primates that actually became dominant, their dopamine, you can see their brain kind of lit up like a Christmas tree. And if you look on the bottom, the subordinate primate, they might as well stayed in the cage. They had no increase in their dopamine activity. So then exposing those individuals to substances, the actual dominant primate did not need to hit the lever because they already were feeling the kind of the dopamine, but it was already in their system, and their brain was already, feeling pretty good. But those that were subordinate and disconnected to their community, in a sense, they needed to hit the lever just to get to the normal stages where the dominant primate was. So again, just think of the broad implications of how kids can feel so marginalized in their family and the community. It hardwires their brains towards drugs. And then look at prison systems. Basically, literally putting people in cages can also hardwire a brain towards social isolation. And social isolation will always result in decreasing dopamine activity, which always results in depression and drug craving. So again, what was the universal experience we had a couple of years ago? A pandemic, social isolation, which can contribute to much of what we're seeing now with increased rates of substance misuse. So increased exposure to substances, particularly at an early age, increases risk of addiction. Here's the brain and its development. It really develops at a young age. As you can see, the activity is developing at a certain age. And what we used to think is the brain fully developed by 18, but we are wrong. And this is Dr. Winter's research that shows that the brain doesn't completely develop until 24 for women, 25 for men, some men maybe 40, who knows more, but we're not here to judge. And the idea here is that the more you can push off the age of onset for exposure to that vulnerable brain, the more you can protect that brain. So it starts with the reptilian part of the brain, and then it moves towards the mammalian part of the brain, and it moves towards, at the end, prefrontal cortex is the last. The sense of judgment is the last part that gets developed, and that doesn't get fully developed, as I said, to 24 and 25. So this is what results with youth being so vulnerable, because it increases the brain development. The neurodevelopment contributes to increase in risk-taking, propensity towards low effort, high excitement activities, an increase in interest in novel stimulation, and a decrease in capacity for good judgment and weighing consequences. So in some ways, this is where kids get in trouble, right? So they look for stimulating activities. They look for risky behaviors, and group settings may actually promote more risk-taking. And a perfect example of this is Bob Francis, a couple of years from RIASEP, it's a youth agency in Bridgeport, did some focus groups in schools in 5 town areas around Bridgeport. And what he did was he took kids and he put them in an auditorium, and he told them that while they were in the auditorium, that there would be a Shark Tank set up. And since there's Shark Tanks going to be set up, would anybody be interested in jumping in the Shark Tank? So again, if I asked you all on this webinar if you'd be interested in taking a dip in the Shark Tank that Mark put in the parking lot for this Sunday, just for giggles, probably most of you would say, no, I don't think so. However, these kids, again, adolescents with a no prefrontal lobe development, many of them actually raised their hand. And it's funny, they'd have like 3 common questions. The first question is, when did the shark eat last? The second would be, would I be bleeding at the time? And the third question has always been my favorite, which is, can I bring a friend in with me to distract the shark? So there was never a kid that raised their hand during this focus group to Bob Francis that said, well, Mr. Francis, on second thought, I don't think that would be a good career move because I might get eaten by the shark. On second thought, is your judgment part of your brain. So kids are exposed to so much during their adolescence without the part of their brain that can actually create, the sense of a filter of good judgment. So want to look at certain drugs and their potential for addiction. Here it is. For the general population, 32% of people that are exposed to tobacco become addicted. 23% of those exposed to heroin become addicted. 17% of those exposed to cocaine become addicted. 9% of those exposed to sedatives become addicted. And 9% of those exposed to cannabis, which is, marijuana, become addicted. So again, you look at these and you think, wow, for the general population, some of these percentages to me look a little low. And they are. Why? Because the general population as adults are generally not, when people get exposed to these drugs, they're getting exposed at an earlier age, which is increasing the risks. So if you start before the age of 18, you take 17% and add it to every one of the numbers above. And if you actually start substance use before the age of 15, you can add 25 to 50% to those factors. So let's look at tobacco, for instance. What's the big thing in middle schools now? Vaping. 7th and 8th graders, vaping. What does that mean? An 80, potentially 82% chance of being addicted to tobacco in their lifetime because of that vulnerability of their brain. So what can we do? Every year that we can delay that substance, we know the risk of developing a substance use disorder is reduced. And we actually have the data in the work that we do with NIAAA, which is the National Institute of Alcoholism. And in that data, they know that if a kid starts drinking, binge drinking, before the age of 14, they have a 40% chance of developing a problem with alcohol in their lifetime. 40% chance, and that's not even taking into account genetic predisposition. However, if that kid moves and has their first drink from not at 14, but at 16, that cuts in half. And from 16 to 18, it cuts in half again. And if that kid has their first drink at the legal age of 21 in all 50 states, they'll have less than a 7% chance of having a problem with alcohol in their lifetime. And let's face it, we just talked about when the brain fully develops. If we actually had drinking age starting at 25, it probably would be closer to 1%. So think about, when was the last time you had a good conversation with your kid? Strike while the iron is cold, to talk to them about some of these things. Wow, this John Hamilton scared the heck out of me in this presentation today. Just wanted to let you know that felt pretty powerless, and have your kids give you the reassurance of how they're navigating their relationship with substances. But the other important message is you got to tailor your conversation based on your relationship with your child and your child's relationship with alcohol and drugs. So for instance, if it's so many times that I have worked with kids and adults where they've come in. I remember these 7th graders would come in, 8th graders, 9th graders into my office and break down and cry because their best friend from preschool no longer talks to them because they've decided that, at their age now, to not drink or not smoke pot or do drugs. So they made that courageous choice, but now their friends who are making those other choices are no longer including them in activities. So don't just assume if your kid's not doing any drugs, like you might feel good about it, like, well, they don't drink and they don't do drugs. Thank God my Johnny or my Billy and my Mia doesn't do that. And then the reality is you want to check in with them because all choices have consequences, and even the choices of being sober and not doing substances oftentimes may be a choice of loss of friends that they've had for years, and maybe loss of activities and a disconnection. So you've got to honor that and kind of stay with where your child's at. If you wanted to be concerned if your child had a problem with alcohol, John Knight from Harvard University developed this very creative acronym as a tool to assess context. Never in this question says he ever actually ask kids how much they drink and what do they drink and what quantity and all. Because oftentimes adolescents are not the most reliable reporters anyway. So instead he asks these questions. Hey, you ever been in a car with the driver impaired, or have you ever been impaired behind the wheel? That obviously puts you at great risk. R in craft is relax. Do you drink to relax? Pre-gaming before you go out. Drinking in a sense of just being able to just mood regulate. Again, now remember that first slide. This is a person that's not drinking to feel good. This is a person who's drinking to feel better. Do you drink alone? Again, social isolation, disconnection, not contextual of sharing experiences with others. Are your family and friends worried about your drinking? And again, for adolescents, most of the time their friends are more kind of in tune with where they're at, and are they concerned about their drinking? Have you ever forgotten anything after a night of drinking, partially or fully of a night that you went out and binge drink? Again, kids that socially drink do not black out. And have you ever gotten in direct trouble as a result of your drinking? If a kid answers yes to 2 or more of these questions, it's time for a more comprehensive assessment. Now, people always want to ask me about marijuana, and especially now that it's being legalized and recreational marijuana in most states, but is it addicting? Remember going back to that slide, it's 9% for the general population, but if a kid starts smoking before 15, it's likely there's probably going to be closer with 30% chance that they will be dependent on tobacco. And this dependency will actually be influenced by 2 or more of these factors that you're seeing on this slide. We also know that it affects mental health, and there's an increase in anxiety, increase in depression, and an increased risk in psychosis as a result of chronic use. It has an anti-analytic effect. So, for instance, medical marijuana around the country, almost every state is regulated differently with different diagnoses that qualify. But what's the great common denominator? That from chronic disease and illness, suffering. So it helps people with the suffering and anxiety of the stress that they have a chronic illness. But if the more they use it, the more it turns on them. It goes from something that reduces anxiety to creating more anxiety. This is the only long-term longitudinal study, and it was in New Zealand. And this was way before the THC levels that we're seeing now, which are closer to 20, 30, and up to 70 to 80%. This was when THC was 5 to 10%. And what they followed was kids from 14 to 21. And as you can see in the red bars, if you smoked marijuana more than 400 times during that 7-year period, and by the way, if you do the math, that's only 3 times a week, you only had a 2% chance of graduating college versus a 36% chance if you never did. You had a much greater chance of unemployment and being on the welfare system than if you didn't do it. So addiction, the good news is there we know about the neuroplasticity of the brain, and the brain is always changing with new attitudes, new behaviors, new thoughts, and abstinence in recovery of the brain. There's actually brain imaging scans that show here, even on methamphetamine, that they know compromises the brain tremendously. A month later, they can see that a month of, as you can see, the normal brain being red, but a month after detox, there's no red in the area, but 2 years later, much of the brain comes back with total abstinence. Who gets into our treatment system? Only 2.3 million Americans actually get involved in specialized treatment a year, which is about 10 to 15%. But sadly, 25 million Americans would qualify for treatment. So we have a product out there that nobody really wants to buy because of stigma and insurance and cost and shame. So only 1 out of 10, for the most part, people are coming into treatment, and we need to do a better job engaging those other 9 out of 10. And then how many harmful users that might just benefit from a small intervention instead of a larger intervention. So the National Institute of Drug Abuse wants to point out there's no single treatment that's appropriate to all. Different treatment works with different people and different individuals at different times in their life and recovery. But it has to focus on biology, behavior, and social context. Here are some multiple pathways of recovery. This comes from a movement that actually is a national movement that started in Connecticut called Connecticut Communities of Addiction Recovery, where what they offer now, which I think is a real game changer in the field of recovery and treatment, is what's called recovery coaches, which is just like an athletic coach or an executive coach. It is somebody that actually is like a sponsor or a counselor, but stays in their lane to be able to help that person find their pathway of recovery, which could be a 12-step program or a religious pathway or secular pathway or medication or exercise or sober community, and harm reduction, which is reducing use, as the pathway to recovery for most. There's also a prevalence of individuals, as I mentioned before, that is self-medicating mental health issues. So 50 to 70% of individuals have a comorbidity of substance use that also have psychiatric, and those with with substance use, 20 to 50% of them also have a diagnosis for psychiatric illness as well. And the most common ones for substance use that has to be looked at is major depression, bipolar disorders, anxiety disorders, trauma, PTSD, and eating issues. The NIAAA guidelines, by the way, so if you want to look at like going back to drinking, how do you become a social drinker? What is a social drinker? NIAAA actually puts guidelines for social drinking, and for men, it means less than 4 drinks a day, for less than totally 14 drinks a week. Again, if you do the math, the 3 drinks a day, after 3 days, you're going to break that limit. On your 4th day or a 5th day, if you have too many drinks, you can't drink consistently because your total has to be 14. And for women, it's less than 3 drinks a day for less than 7 drinks per week. Now, if you stay within those weekly and daily parameters and you never exceed them, you'll only have 1 in 100 chance of having a problem with alcohol in your lifetime because you reduce the exposure to the brain. However, if you exceed the daily limits on a regular basis, and like binge drink more than 4 or 5 drinks in any setting, now your chances go from 1 to 100 to 1 in 5. And if you exceed the weekly and daily limits on a regular basis, it's a coin toss. You have a 50% chance of having a problem with alcohol just from that alcohol exposure, independent of your genetic predisposition. Let me tell you a little bit about my program. Liberation is a nonprofit behavioral health agency whose mission is to provide prevention, treatment, and recovery services to help individuals and their families impacted by substance use and mental health conditions to foster hope and maintain wellness. At the end of the day, really what we offer people is hope. Some of the services I'm just going to cover include our wellness van, outpatient services, intensive outpatient services, and inpatient services. This is our cool Peace, Love, and Liberation van. What we have here is 2 vans that go out in the community and help do outreach, help engage those other 9 out of 10 people that haven't shown any interest in coming into treatment. And right now with the fentanyl epidemic, honestly, we're just trying to keep them alive. We're giving them fentanyl strips. We'll give them clean needles so they don't have to share and die. And that becomes what we offer them. Some people might think it's enabling, and yes, it's enabling people to stay alive. Because 2023 may not be the year of the recovery for them. Pelletier Wellness Center, this is our outpatient program in Bridgeport, Connecticut. That building alone serves over 900 individuals a day in medication-assisted treatment for opioid disorder, which includes all 3 FDA medications, methadone, buprenorphine, what's called injectable naltrexone and Vivitrol. We provide individual, group, family support, recovery coaching, recovery management, relapse prevention. IOP, intensive outpatient, means 3 times a week for 3 hours a day of outpatient groups and individuals, medication-assisted treatment and mental health services. We also have a federally qualified health center in that building that provides primary care as well. Families in Recovery program. We were one of the first in the country, the first in Connecticut to have a women and children's program. Women oftentimes have obstacles for treatment that men don't, and it's usually around childcare and transportation. So women should never be in a position to have to choose between their kids and sobriety and recovery. So we provide a program in Norwalk where women can actually bring their kids in. And it's the only program in Fairfield County that allows women to come in with their children, and the only program in all of Connecticut that allows a woman to bring in more than 1 child. Very successful program to help them empower them, not just in recovery, but as parents as well. Liberation House is one of our landmark programs. We were founded 52 years ago to liberate the community from the scourge of drug addiction. And we put this program on Main Street. It has a methadone program, medication-assisted treatment program in the same building. It's right off of Washington Avenue. And we've been there for 52 years, and it serves 65 individuals for 3 months of treatment and supports them in all the program supports of individual, group, family, case management, recreation, and have them live in a kind of a recovery environment for a healing process. And I mentioned NIDA. We're actually involved in several National Institute of Drug Abuse studies, including studying buprenorphine, which is a partial agonist, one of the new medications for opiate disorders, because we don't know how to keep people engaged on buprenorphine. And we also, there's a discontinuation arm. We don't know who can come off safely without relapsing. So that's very important for us to consider as well. One of the problems with treatment is it's set up sometimes where people are in crisis, they go to a residential program, they come out, right? So it's set up as an acute disease model. And what we do is stabilize the symptoms. They come out and they oftentimes don't get any support when they come out, so they relapse again. So what we need to do is develop a model, which is what recovery coaching helps with now, to get people to not have to be in crisis and go in residential. Try to keep them in the community whenever possible and keep them in the recovery zone. So give them some more support over time is the best outcomes. We also have to build on the recovery capital, which is a collection of all their personal, social, and community resources that are available to start and sustain recovery journeys. So as I said, we're trying to know who can come off buprenorphine safely, but we don't know who has the recovery capital. If only what we do know for opiate use disorder, that if you're not on one of those 3 medications, buprenorphine, methadone, or Vivitrol, you have only a 10% chance of staying in sustained recovery. You have a 90% chance your first year of relapsing. We don't know who that 1 in 10 is that has the recovery capital necessary to not take the medication. So we try to give everyone at least an understanding of the benefits of this medication to quiet their brain until the miracle happens. Harm reduction is another strategy, which is meeting people where they are without our agenda. Because let's face it, everybody's on the continuum from no use to chaotic use. And we need to tailor interventions based on their level of motivation and where they are in this continuum. So I mentioned enabling. Enabling gets bad press. It's just everyone shows love the best way they know how. And what we try to do with our family program is redefine relationships in a manner that promotes recovery for everyone. Because as I said, everyone makes the best choices available to them at the time. And it may not be one that supports their recovery or their loved ones. So what we want to also do here is recognize that the loved one's recovery is independent of the person who they're trying to get into recovery. The other strategies, the more you show you're humanist, the more you're lovable. This is with work with your kids, by the way, instead of trying family meals. I use that as an example. If you come home tonight or tomorrow and your kids at the table, you don't say, hey, how'd you do in that calculus test today with a close-ended question where they probably just say, fine. You want to say instead, hey, let me tell you about what an ass I made on myself at work today. I was doing this presentation and I wasn't paying attention and I fell back on my chair and everybody laughed. It was so embarrassing. Then you have your son or daughter more likely to say, Dad, you think that was embarrassing? You should have seen what happened to me in the locker last Tuesday when I was at my locker. It was horrible. Now you're starting an authentic conversation by leading by example. So what's reasonable parenting? Parenting based on who your child is and not who you want them to be or you think they should be. Think about who believed in you. This is how you build resiliency with your kids. How did you know? What were the messages? What are the messages you give your kids that give them the message that you have faith in them, you believe in them? In adolescent development, kids need to individuate, separate, and be autonomous. So again, it's not about trust because unless they're wearing a cape and can read your mind and have your wisdom, you can't trust they'll make every decision you have with your life experience. You have to have faith that they're making the best decisions available to them at the time. If you really want some vulnerability in talking with your kids or your grandkids or build any relationship in your life, you want to ask, hey, how am I doing as your parent? What am I doing well? What could I do better? What do you feel you could tell me? Do you feel like you could tell me anything? And if not, what can I do to be a better listener? What am I doing that's getting in the way of you being honest? Again, if you notice, all these questions are about your own vulnerability. It's not asking the kid anything. It's just asking them about you and your relationship with them in a vulnerable stance. Mental health in a nutshell, by the way, is the ability to feel lovable, capable, and connected. So you always want to have those in your life move in the direction to have them feel loved, capable, and connected to something greater than themselves. Other strategies is listen to your kids, strive to understand them and take their concerns seriously, affirm them just because they are, not for what their achievements are. You want to also enjoy your mate more than your kids. The greatest gift a father can give to his children is to love their mother, and the greatest gift a mother can give to their children is to love their father. This is where you learn intimacy. Be authentic, lead by example, have faith over trust, as I mentioned, try to influence over control, and delay that onset for first use. But most importantly, remember to show your kids and anybody in your life how much you care before you show them how much you know. All right. Now that's a lot of information. You could certainly have those slides to look at. Did I miss anything? Did I overwhelm you with information, or hopefully it was helpful? I see there was a question in the chat. I didn't get to it because I was on a roll. Sorry. What have we got here?
John, the question is from John Dexheimer. The Surgeon General has come out with a focus on loneliness. How much is this a part of the drug abuse cause?
Yeah.
What are the root causes of drug abuse in the US? In other societies, how should we treat the root causes before they reach the edge cases that result in drug abuse? And I think
Wow.
we started to get some of that, but
yeah, no, those are great questions. Again, in a nutshell, I would say the root cause is disconnection to self, disconnection to community, disconnection to feelings. Kids that are alexithymic, they would know a feeling if it bit them in the butt. Those are all markers and those are all predictors. Some people say that the real gateway drug is trauma and toxic stress. There's a study that you're probably maybe familiar with called an ACEs study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, which you answer 10 questions about neglect or abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. A kid could check off 10 of those yes. And again, it's a predictor of lower mortality, chronic disease, and addiction. However, if the kid has one consistent, reliable, supportive, loving adult in their life, it transcends all those traumas. So, the root cause is trauma and not being comfortable in their own skin because things happen. I recommend reading Gabor Mate. He's a Hungarian psychiatrist a physician who lives in Vancouver, who wrote a book called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And had the most provocative kind of take that I've seen ever, which is basically that all addiction is rooted in trauma. But he expands it into really a lack of attachment. Healthy attachment to like the love object when you're born, you feel loved. That goes back to feeling lovable, capable, and connected. If you don't have you have a fragile attachment, you're pretty much screwed. Your life is going to be hard for you because you're not going to believe if your own flesh and blood can't be there for you and each other, then why is some complete stranger going to give and receive love? So you chemically simulate that love through substance misuse or use just to have an intimate relationship with a substance that could be a lot more reliable than people who have let you down. That's kind of a long answer to a really good question.
Why don't you follow up on Tim's? This is John. I have a follow-up to that exact thing, but Tim posted something. How do you work with the 12-step programs, Alcoholics Anonymous or Celebrate Recovery, to assist individuals in recovery? And then I'll come back to how do we address the root cause?
Okay. Well, it's a good question. I mean, we believe, obviously AA saves lives and so does NA and 12-step recovery, but it's not everyone's pathway. So we expose people to meetings. We bring in outside meetings. We give people the chance to be able to use that as their vehicle, but we also respect there are multiple pathways to recovery. So what we want to have is before the person leaves their treatment for us, we want them to find the pathway that's going to work for them. Recovery is recovering the lost parts of yourself. The first part of recovery is recovering physically. They used to call it detox. Now they call it withdrawal management, getting the toxins out of the system. Then us as treatment providers provide recovery physically and psychologically, to have the person feel comfortable in their own skin and make positive statements and be more accepting and forgiving themselves and others. But I've never seen anybody that has had sustained recovery without spiritual recovery. They have to find something greater than their drug of choice. 12-step recovery is a wonderful opportunity for people to find that personal spiritual journey, but so is their faith community, or so is anything that's going to give them greater in the meaning than their drug of choice.
If I could jump in.
Yeah.
I asked the question. I'll put a plug in for Celebrate Recovery. You talk about spiritual.
Yes.
As the key. I happen to attend to Celebrate Recovery. Fortunately, mine is not a chemical issue, like drugs or alcohol.
Okay.
But that program is what we would refer to as a Christ-centered 12-step, and the key we see in a recovery program is we name our spiritual, the key to our recovery is Jesus Christ, is our belief in Jesus Christ, as our I forget the term that AA uses, but
higher power,
correct.
Yeah,
I should know that. And I would just say that the Celebrate Recovery also emphasizes the community issue. I couldn't agree more with about the opposite of addiction is isolation. Isolation is a huge issue for people that are dealing with all sorts of addiction issues, and Celebrate Recovery deals with what we refer to as hurts, habits, and hangups. So it's a wide variety of issues, not only chemical dependencies.
Hurts and hangups. Yeah. Go ahead.
I did a lot of work with NAMI and was on the board and worked with Liberation when I lived in Stanford.
Cool.
And the thing is that with mental illness is the isolation is so terrible. But the one thing that the epidemic did bring out is now people are at least talking about it.
Yeah.
And even drug addiction, people are starting to talk about it. And it's not like, it's behind the closet door anymore. So hopefully we can start rebounding and going backwards and gaining some kind of positive things and supporting each other.
Yeah. two years ago, we started a program with Stanford Hospital, Stanford Health, in their primary care on High Ridge Road, because docs were dealing with patients that they dealt with for years. And for the first time after COVID, they said, Doc, I know what's going on. I'm day drinking, or most of them are saying, I'm just really anxious, or I'm really scared, and I'm frightened, and I don't know what to do, or I'm really depressed more than I've ever been. So we actually embedded therapists in their primary care office and seeing them the same day. And now, we went from one clinician 2 years ago to now I think we're at 6 clinicians, and we've expanded into Greenwich, and we're even getting another office in Stanford, just because the need is so great of so many people that are struggling with, mental health issues that they never had before. But to your point, I think if there's something good that's come out of it, it was that universal experience that everybody can relate. And I think it has reduced some of the stigma.
It sure has.
But it is the issue, or if you read every survey, and it's interesting to see this. I was surprised by the Surgeon General announcement, just because every Surgeon General needs something to hang his hat on, right?
Yeah.
And that this was it for this one. And it really resonated, because all surveys all across the board deal with this as an issue. Yet, how do you deal with the root cause, right? The reality is we want to engineer you out of business.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's the reality, right?
Yeah.
We don't want you in business.
Yeah. My goal is to turn us into a prevention agency. And here's my bias, John. I'll tell you where it starts. It starts with us as adults having healthy relationships and being role models. It starts with what I always said, that the greatest gift a father can give to his children is to love their mother. And what does that mean? It means teaching kids belief in dignity and respect and kindness at home. And if you're a single parent, it still applies. Get a life outside your kids. Kids have 2 jobs: to receive love and learn. Their job isn't to make you happy. And parents just screw that up left and right, with sometimes not with the best of intentions, because of their own struggles and their own issues and maybe their own experience. And everybody has a bias coming in from their own family. And I think it has to start before a kid's even born, to be able to have each other's back and support each other. And I think we're kind of misguided on that. We sacrifice, we'll throw ourselves in front of a bus for our kids, but sometimes we throw our partner in front of the bus first. It's like we got it wrong. There's work to be done with treating each other like, and then the worst thing to tell our kids is, don't worry, life sucks now. Don't worry, it'll get better, when you get older. Like, no, you look pretty miserable. So you got to role model joy too, and happiness and resiliency and conflict resolution and building a sense of hope. I think that's where we address the root causes, is not being such a miserable society. Who is it? The person that started our Families in Recovery program was Crystal Truglia. People might know her. She was a legislator from Stanford. And she had told me once that she met with Mother Teresa when Mother Teresa came to this country. And Mother Teresa said, she's seen such poverty in impoverished nations, obviously, like others haven't, but she's never seen a nation that's been so spiritually impoverished as the United States. So I think we got work to do.
Yeah, that Celebrate Recovery is part of the program. We are going after those root causes, character defects, because the addiction is like the flower that you see at the above the surface, but there's all these roots underneath that are really driving that addiction.
Yeah. I think
the pain and loneliness.
Put it as a weed instead of a flower.
That's probably a better term.
I want to ask you a fentanyl question, because I have no experience. I have no knowledge other than, limited reading in the paper. And I talked to a friend today whose wife just had a biopsy for cancer and 65, 66 years old. And she was treated with fentanyl. And it's like, it's actually got a role, apparently. I
70% of all
think of this today. Today,
anesthesia used in this country for surgery includes fentanyl. It works as an anesthesia. It works for that purpose. It doesn't work for something that's not meant to be sustainable.
Yeah. Okay. Right. That's what I figure. So the question is, how is that a risk at all? I'm just thinking there.
That's the fentanyl that you're getting from China. In fact, there's also an economic piece here. $30,000 of pure fentanyl gets converted to $1.2 million of street heroin.
Yeah, so
So it's an economic thing, and it's something that's just so adulterated. And as I said, they're putting xylazine and all this other stuff in it that's just like eating away people's flesh and causing all these problems. And but the idea of what the increased exposure to the brain is what's going to increase the risk. So if it's used during surgery, it's short acting. That's why it's so great for surgery, because it said it works, but it's out of your system in an hour. You're not, it's very powerful but short acting. So it's not meant to be that level of exposure. When people would leave, they did one study just with prescription drugs like Percocet, and if you had surgery and you left with a 30-day supply of Vicodin, Percocet, or Oxycontin, you had a 40% chance of still taking that medication 12 months later. We know that now. You can't be taking that level of medication without a risk for dependency.
so that's been stopped in terms of
That's been
legitimate
stopped, but
hospitals.
be addicted, then shifted to fentanyl or heroin. That's the trouble.
Right.
There was a
Okay.
supply issue without addressing the demand issue, which
Yeah,
again, here's the root cause issue. Another great question for the root cause is what makes it so attractive about our society and our communities to be able to want people to take fentanyl. That's the root cause. Is like we're creating a sense of hopelessness and despair. Why not? Kids saying, what the hell, might as well just live for today, because it doesn't look like we have a bright future. I don't think we do a good job instilling reasonable hope. And I don't think we do a good job on mood regulation and self-regulation for kids early on. How do kids learn mood regulation? And again, how do we role model mood regulation? You know, if we're not comfortable in our own skin, how can our kids be?
So that's not, that's not your organization's prime responsibility. Who do you work with to give that message to saying, hey, look, we don't want to see your kids.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Here's the message.
Yeah.
Stop it there.
Yeah. Well, I don't think not everybody wants to hear that message, John, but you're right. We're in Greenwich High School. We have a substance use counselor in the high school, as well as Staples High School in Westport. We're in the schools in Stanford. We're in the schools. Here's what we're trying to do: get down to lower grades. The trouble is, most of these prevention programs, they're useless. They're not effective from an evidence-based program. So like DARE, for instance, 15 independent studies showed that DARE did make an impact, but 2 of the 15 studies showed that it sparked curiosity of kids to get involved in drugs they wouldn't have otherwise got involved in. So 13 studies said it was a waste of time, it had no impact, but 2 said it made things worse. So there's a perfect example. But parents love it. And maybe what it did was help de-vilify law enforcement, which wasn't such a bad thing. However, that wasn't the primary goal. The primary goal was to reduce, and prevent drug use. It wasn't happening. What we need to do is in high school, for instance, we need to be able to promote different messages tailored to different audiences. We can't insult kids' intelligence and their experience with drugs. So we have to give certain messages, understanding about the brain, but also harm reduction messages to kids, how to use more safely to keep them alive if they are using. But right now through the country, the majority of programs are abstinence-based, and they're in high school. Move them down to the middle school, move mood regulation and self-regulation down to primary school ages. And again, take it even back further, and everybody should be getting a license to be married like you do you get a license to drive. But people suck when it comes to finding choices, and the kids have to have to be the outcome of that. We got to do a better job.
So you raise an interesting the
I'm going to
mention.
get a question in before this ends, right? So,
Okay.
Well, just,
Yeah,
go ahead, John.
Sorry, go ahead, Mark. Or go ahead.
Anthony, did you have a question?
Yeah, I
Yes.
do.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm just conscious of the time also. Mr. Hamill, thank you so much for the information and the work that you do in the city. Really, God bless you and your team. You've spoken at bits in the presentation and in the questions around your engagement with the community, whether it be Stanford Health or other organizations. Can you just speak a little further about how else you're engaged in the community? And the other flip side of that, where are the community engagements that are not there that need to be to make your program more successful and the city better capable of addressing this problem?
Oh, that's a great question. And we do have a great relationship with the city, but we are engaged in a lot of innovative programs. We just got a Bureau of Justice program through the federal government to partner with law enforcement. So we have a memorandum of agreement with the chief of police in Stamford, Greenwich, and in Bridgeport to follow every overdose and provide a recovery coach or a family recovery coach or an overdose prevention specialist to that person that just had an overdose. So I think we have to do a lot more partnering with police. I think we do a good job with the hospitals, even though now they're just putting recovery coaches in emergency rooms to help people get engaged. But I don't think we do enough in outreach to be able to help people that are interested in treatment and don't even want to see themselves in recovery, help reduce use. We work with the schools, but again, every school is its own fiefdom. We have 169 towns regulated by 169 Board of Education. So you can't even standardize what we try to offer in schools. So that becomes a challenge. I also think in the criminal justice system, we need to push back more on pre-prosecutorial diversion. And there's a program in Hartford and Bridgeport, for instance, where they look at cases that are substance use related, and then they allow them to actually offer some treatment. And if the person doesn't, then they charge them. Because on top of everything else, the last thing you want to have is people with a criminal record, because I don't think we can criminalize or lock ourselves out of this, away from this problem. So I think there's got to be a lot more efforts, and faith communities. We could partner a lot more with faith communities as well. But we're so busy keeping our hands filled with people coming in and trying to save lives. You know, we really, we could do a better job with our partnership, but we could do a lot more if we had more time and more personnel. And of course, on top of everything, there's a workforce shortage, although we added 50 new staff this year to meet the need out there in the community. But it's hard to find licensed staff, because people could be, a licensed clinician now could be in the basement of their house and do telehealth for 3 times what we can pay them in a nonprofit. So there's a lot of challenges to bring this to scale.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Any other final question?
I thought, it's not a question, but this is a fantastic presentation. And I wish there was a way to get this presentation out to more people, because it really was a great overview and understanding.
Well, you got it on video, so you can disseminate it wherever you want. I'm just trying to think in my head now, what did I say that's going to get me in trouble?
Well, Marietta, it will be going out this Friday to the whole of St. Francis, and I hope that people will pick it up, and I'm sure Dwayne will be distributing it to St. John's as well. I was struck also, just John, when you were talking about the schools and the DARE, the study of that.
Yeah.
Those programs also are ways for us not to take responsibility. We say, well, there's a program for that, you know, and I think part of what you're saying is we all, and parents especially, need to take responsibility and you know, do the modeling and all of that. And it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning when you presented to the clergy last fall. I just was really impressed with the one thing you mentioned about, because we know this stuff about the brain and the context and all of that, it isn't about judgment, it's about compassion. That's just so critical to working, you know, in this area.
That's the key. I mean, what we want to offer is just dignity and respect and kindness to people. That's what treatment really is. All the other, you know, interventions are icing on the cake, but people oftentimes feel a sense of self-loathing and shame. All we want them to do is give them a glimmer of hope that if some stranger might love them, they may be lovable.
Well, we have hope because you are doing what you're doing and you're working with the people you're working with, and we really are appreciative of your time and just all that you shared tonight, and continued blessings on your work, and thank you for all that you do.
Thank you, Mark. It was my pleasure. It's my honor. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Night all.
Take care.